For the presentation is listed here on the screen. No need to fill out the who's in the room since this is recorded. All right, so welcome. My name is Rebecca Stokes. I'm the Professional Development Specialist and Product Manager for SchoolNet with the Digital Teaching and Learning Division of DPI. I have 14 years in education with years in the classroom as a math and science teacher in 4th and 5th grade, been an instructional technology coach, digital literacy coach, 2nd grade self-contained teacher, and a digital teaching and learning specialist. If you were with us at NCBOLD, then I was asking for some information about you, so no need to fill that out. All right, so our objectives today are to look at the now what portion of data in SchoolNet and explore different ways to personalize student learning using other platforms such as Seesaw and Google Classroom, and discuss strategies that have worked for you in the classroom. All right, so let's talk about SchoolNet data. So when you go into SchoolNet and you are looking at your data reports, this is what is going to show up under the very first report, which is just your overview. And I just have it zoomed in here, but I'm actually going to pull up the training site just to show you how to get to this. Okay, so I am now in SchoolNet. This is the training site, but it should look like what your screen looks like when you log into your SchoolNet. So you can get to your data a few different ways. You can either come down to your Choose a Section widget and select which class you would like to look at and click Reports, or you can scroll down to your Classroom Assessment Manager, and it's going to show your benchmark assessments and then your classroom assessments here as well. And you can change the assessment. So like this one is the reading review, but I can click this down arrow here to choose a different assessment. So I'm going to go to the reporting dashboard, which is over here on the left-hand side. And I'm just going to click reporting dashboard. And this is just going to list all of those reports for that particular class. So this is for a reading subject, and then I can choose an assessment. And your test summary is going to be the report that we were looking at in the presentation. So if I go back here, okay. All right, so when you're looking at your test summary, you're going to see this colorful circle here, and it's going to give you an average score and then the percentage of students proficient. This is going to depend on how many students you have that have submitted the assessment. So if you don't see anything here, it is because you don't have a lot of students that have submitted. And then on the right-hand side is going to go ahead and sort your students into their score groups, and it's going to give you the percent of students in that score group, the number of students, and then the score range that that score group is. SchoolNet is also going to have the words proficient and not proficient here. And I'll show you that right here. So you can see it's going to show proficient and not proficient. Okay. And it's going to list proficient and not proficient. It cannot be changed as to what is considered proficient in SchoolNet. So just know that if you feel that anything less than a 70 is not proficient, that you will need to consider the students that are in this lighter orange area as well. You can change score groups or cut scores, but it is still going to list not proficient as 60 and below. All right, so let's go back here. All right, so if we are looking at our data and this is what we see, then we can go in and determine that these three students in the blue and the green we would consider as proficient because they were in the score group of 90 to 100. These students in the orange area here that are in the 60 to 69, well, they still need additional support. And then the students in the red were not proficient. So this kind of helps guide us as to how we need to differentiate our instruction, whether to do small groups or remediation, reteaching, whatever the case may be. Using this data helps us determine who we need to be concentrating on for that particular standard or standard set. Okay, so below, go back here. Below this test summary, if you scroll down, then it's going to list all of your students. It's going to tell you the date and the time they submitted, and it's going to give you their average score, their proficiency, and then the score group. And right beside each of these is a light arrow letting you know that you can sort. So if I wanted to sort the students by their average score, then I can do that, and it's going to group them for me that way. Or I can group by their proficiency. This would not be as beneficial because even though they were listed as proficient, in this case with 71%, I would still want them to have additional support and remediation. So I personally don't like to sort by proficiency when I'm looking at creating my small groups, but you are more than welcome to do that. And you can also sort by the score groups as well. I prefer to sort by the average score, so that I can group my students by color, and I can see these orange students need to be in a group, these yellow, these green, and then these blue need an enrichment activity. If you have an assessment that has multiple standards, you can also come up here where the performance comparison and click standard as well. And it's going to show you all of the standards that were on your assessment. And if you hover over them, it's going to actually list the entire standard, which is really helpful. And then it's going to tell you how many items you had per standard. And then it's going to give you the average score. Now, this does not break it down by student, but it does break it down by standards so that you can see, okay, this standard right here, this language 3.4, everyone was proficient, same as our RL 3.1. So I don't need to remediate those two standards, but I do need to remediate this standard and this one because they are yellow. And if you kind of hover over it, just popped up and then went away. Trying to get it to hover. It will tell you how many students were proficient, but of course, since there we go. So 13 out of 17 students were proficient in this standard. And then same thing here, 24 out of 34. And I can click right here, and that's going to give you related instructional materials that are just through SchoolNet based off of that standard. All right, so let's go back to student. Let's go back here. Okay, so we are looking at our list of students, and so my question was, what does this data help show us? And the answer would be that it helps us know how to personalize excuse me, our students' learning. So I sorted by average score, and I can see which ones were proficient and which ones were not, just by sorting that data there. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is on that same assessment, so we're going to look at the item analysis. This is going to break down each question so that we can really get an idea of which questions within a standard might have confused the students, tripped them up, or we can just see what they're not proficient in and what we as the teacher need to focus on when we are remediating. So if I go back to SchoolNet, your test summary or your item analysis, excuse me, is what we're going to look at next. There's also a standard analysis, which will give you a more in-depth look at the percentages of proficiency for each standard. So I did want to show that because what you can do, so it's going to give you this bar graph right here, and it's going to give you that same data that we just saw, where it gives us the score per standard. But if you scroll down, then it's going to give you the students and it's going to show how they did on that standard. So we had seen that this standard, everyone was proficient here, so we're not going to focus on that one. But this standard right here that had 70%, then I can sort that and I can see these students missed that question completely, whereas the rest were proficient. So I need to focus on this standard and this question with these 4 students. So these data reports are really beneficial just in drilling down into your data to be able to see what support your students need instead of just looking at the whole standard and saying, okay, well, distinguish the literal and non-literal meaning of words and phrases in context. Okay, well, that can encompass a whole lot of material. But if I go into the item analysis and look at the question, then me and these 4 students can really dig deep into that question and see, was it a vocabulary word? Was it a misconception? Do they not have an understanding of literal and non-literal? Can I give them more examples? Things like that. So you can go through each standard to break those down. So if your assessment is just on one standard, this report is not going to be beneficial, but the item analysis is. So when I go to item analysis, it's going to take a minute to populate, but while it does that, I'm going to come back here. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. I meant to hit this one. There we go. It's going to show all of the questions. So this was a formative assessment, only 5 questions. It's going to give you the percentages for each item, and it's going to give you the primary standard, and then it's going to tell you the correct answer. And then once this populates, you'll be able to see everything else. Yep. Okay, so we're at the item analysis, and you can see where it's listing all of the items. This is a different report than what is in the presentation. So this one's got 7 items. But below each one of these items listed, it's going to list all of your students as well, and it's going to give a check mark if they got it right, and it's going to list the answer that they chose if they got it incorrect. You can also come up here and you can click to highlight the low performing students. So it's going to automatically pull out those students that were listed as not proficient. And depending on your test settings, when you're creating the assessment, if you select to have it listed as student response times, then underneath each one of these, it'll tell you how much time the students spent per question as well, which is really beneficial because if you see that majority of the students spent 5 minutes on a question and then a student that got it wrong spent 15 seconds, then that kind of already lets you know that they didn't read the question. So when you're talking about remediation, you don't have to necessarily wonder, are they not proficient on this standard? Or do they need some test taking strategies or stamina exercises to help them get through an assessment without clicking through and finishing the test too soon. But if we come back up here, let's go back over here. Okay, so with this particular data set, then I can focus and see that items 2 and 3 were both really low. And item 5, I would want to look at as well. So item 1, 100% of my students got that correct. And then item 4, 80%. So I'd still want to focus on those 1 or 2 students to see what was going on with that question. But I can see for 2, 3, and 5 that a lot of the students got that incorrect. So anything that's blue in SchoolNet is hyperlinked. So if I were to click on item 1 right here, it would pop open the question. So we're going to just look at items 2 and 3. And if I were to scroll down, then I could see how the students answered. So in question 2, we can see that the answers are all kind of varied. But there was no really pattern. But in question 3, I can see that the students that got it incorrect all selected A, which really gives me insight into that question. So question 2 is at the top and question 3 is at the bottom. And as the teacher, I can go through and read this question and see, okay, this is the one that the students had very varied answers. So I can see Sarah poured 40 hundredths gallon of water in the sink. Afterwards, she poured 5/10 gallon. What is the total amount that was poured into the sink? So I can see there's some vocabulary here of poured 5/10, letting us know how much she deducted from the gallon of water. What is the total amount of water that Sarah poured into the sink? So we poured 40 hundredths and then we poured 5/10. The denominators are different, which gives me some insight as well. And then I can go back and see, okay, I had 1, 2, 3 students choose B, which lets me know that they just subtracted 40 minus 5 to get a numerator of 35. They did not change the denominators when they were adding these two totals together. So that lets me focus on what those students need practice on. I can see I had 2 students choose A, where we got 1/10, which lets me know that they did change denominators. So they would have changed this one to 4/10 and 5/10, but they subtracted the 5/10 minus the 4/10 to get the 1/10. So they know how to convert the fractions. They just struggled with whether they should add or subtract. So they might need practice with breaking down word problems and when it asks for total amount, what that means. Let's see, we had 2 students choose C, which again lets me know that they did not change denominators. They just added 40 hundredths and 5/10. So they understood that total amount meant add, but they did not convert the fractions. So it really just helps break down what each student group needs for additional practice and support. Now, question 3 was where everyone that got it wrong chose A. Okay, so after a party, there was 4/10 of a chocolate cake and 24 hundredths of a yellow cake. What fraction of cakes were there all together? So these students that all chose A, they know that all together means add, and that's what they did. They added 24 and 4 to get 28. So they did not convert those fractions. So even though the students might have known to convert them here, something caused them not to convert it here. It could have been a distraction of the word cake, and they started thinking about what cake they like, which, that would even happen as adults. So we understand that. So that might just be a test taking strategy of getting rid of information that you don't need. Like they didn't need to know there was chocolate cake or yellow cake. They just needed to know the 4/10 and 24 hundredths, and then what the problem was actually asking. So that could be a test taking strategy that's worked on with those students as well. But that item analysis just helps us break down what the students need. Okay, so now that we know what we need to focus on with the students, then we can use our LMS platforms to personalize the learning for the students. So one that I had used previously in the classroom was Seesaw with my second graders. So I know a lot of K2 PSUs might use Seesaw. So these are just some strategies that worked for me. Of course, these are not things that you have to do, just some suggestions. First thing is in SchoolNet, you can search for lesson plans, instructional units, and activities that you can use. They're already created. They might be submitted by another teacher, or they might be something a teacher submitted from a website that they found beneficial. But when you go to your materials search, let me go back over here. If you go on the left-hand side, it says instructional materials. That is where this screen is pulled from, and it's going to look like this. Go back over here. But you can search the standard, or you can search a keyword, or if you just knew that your students needed assistance with converting fractions, you could put that. But you can filter by the subject and the grade level, and then it's going to list any materials that they may have. So for this one in particular, there was 10 North Carolina materials and there was 65 Go Open materials. I do recommend going through and actually looking at the materials yourself instead of just printing it out and planning on using it before actually looking through it to make sure links work or to make sure that you like the activity that it gives. But those are just some suggestions of the materials you can use in SchoolNet. And there was a misconception that this was only for higher grades or like 3rd through 12th tested grades. But you can see over here that just when I did mathematics, that we have several hundred resources in kindergarten, and then we're getting into the thousands with 1st and 2nd grade. So there are materials for K2 as well. All right, so once we have done remediation with the students and you're ready to reassess, you did want to point out that in SchoolNet, you can assign assessments to specific students. So you do not have to give your entire class the same assessment when you are remediating and then retesting. So when you go in and you've created your formative assessment or your summative, depending on what you're doing, when you are ready to schedule it, you can, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Instead of assigning it to your entire section, you can click to assign it to individual students and then choose the students that need that particular assessment. So if you create a formative assessment just on converting fractions with unlike denominators for those 4 students that needed that, and you're ready to retest, you can just select those 4 students and have them take that assessment. So did want to point that out, that you can assign to individual students. All right, but if we are in Seesaw, one helpful tip that helped me as a 2nd grade teacher was when the students come in originally, when they are rostered in, or if you are adding them in, they're going to be given default little icons, or if you are adding them, then it's going to look like this. But something that was beneficial for me is I went in to the students' profiles and changed their icons depending on what group they were going to be in for remediation or enrichment. So for example, all of these students that originally had these icon bubbles now look like this, letting me know that the dolphins are going to be in a remediation group together because they needed that remediation on the same topics. Same thing with the lions or the turtles. And you would be able to change these as your groups change, because we know that that's going to be fluid and the students are, depending on the objectives, going to go up and down in their data scores. So you would be able to change this and change those groups as the students are changing as well. So when we go back to our data, we saw these 3 students had 100, these 4 were in the 60s, and then these 3 were not proficient. So I would know that if I needed my remediation task, so this one in particular was decimal notation, then I would go to my groups and I would only assign this activities to the turtles, which would have been all of the students that needed that particular remediation example. And then once I've assigned it, I, as the teacher, can see the students listed here and I can just go in and check that work. Same thing for enrichment. Once I am either assigning enrichment activities for this group, or I have met with this group and we have done some enrichment together, and then I'm ready to see how they comprehend that enrichment, then I would just assign it to those students that needed that. And then some additional suggestions were to add audio and to all written text directions for extra personalization and modification for those students that need that audio, especially if you are not doing whole group or not meeting with that group at that particular time. You can record your voice to give directions for the students instead of them just reading it, especially for our K2, which might struggle with that. You can also record your screen to show an example so the students can hear your voice and see a visual example of what you're asking them to do, just like they would see in person if you were doing the activity with them, so they can watch that video to see the artifact that you are wanting them to complete. Some suggestions for Google Classroom is same thing with the audio directions. You can use the Mote extension to add audio notes to any of your activities or your text. You can also use Screencastify to record your screen, or like today I'm using Loom to give the students an example of what it is that you're asking them to do. But if I had students that needed a remediation video and then activity, I can complete the instructions, attach what it is I need, and only assign it to those students that need that remediation or enrichment. I have an example and a copy of an example up here of different activities that you could do. And then same thing with the enrichment. And then as the teacher, I can see how many students have the enrichment, how many students have their remediation, and you're basing it just on your data that you got from SchoolNet to then be able to differentiate for those students. So I did have a Padlet during NCBOLD of asking people some suggestions of what works for them in the classroom on how they personalize their learning using data. So you can click on this Padlet to see what other people said. But these were just some examples of adding audio, recording your screen, changing your page setup and slides to give you some extra space for drag and drop activities. Make your color transparent. If you are trying to highlight an object or highlight text, you can put a shape on there and fill it with a transparent color. And you can also, here's just a little tip of if you need students to type somewhere, you can insert a text box that already says type text here, and it will disappear as the students start typing. All of that is in the examples here. And that was it. That was how we went over personalizing your learning based off of your SchoolNet data. So if you have any additional questions or any questions on SchoolNet specifically, you can reach out to me at my email address of rebecca.stokes@dpi.nc.gov, or you can call me or text me. I am happy to assist any way I can.